Yo, what's going on, YouTube, and welcome to Goal Line Hockey. It's Kevin Forte, and today we are continuing our season preview videos as we are taking a look today at the Minnesota Wild. The Minnesota Wild had a good season last year, obviously finishing in disappointment, losing in the first round of the playoffs, but a good season last year, some good goaltending, and some promising prospects coming in this season. What do we think of the Minnesota Wild? Can they make the playoffs again, or do you think they're going to fall just short with some of the competition in their division and in the Western Conference? We're going to take a look at that today. All right, so let's get right into it. So some of the changes for the Minnesota Wild, it's a pretty short list. Sam Steele is no longer on the team. Gustav Nyquist goes down to Nashville, and that's about it. John Klingberg no longer here, right? Some of those rental guys didn't return. But we did see Pat Maroon come in, and that adds an element to this team that is kind of interesting. Now, he's obviously that replacement to Ryan Reeves. As Ryan Reeves now goes to the Leafs, the Minnesota Wild bring in Patrick Maroon from a trade from the Tampa Bay Lightning and Maxim Kachkovic. Obviously, Maroon is the focal point of that deal, but, I think this is a good move for the Minnesota Wild. They're bringing in that guy that's going to be that, that calming sense in the locker room, and I like that move for that reason. Really not much else for the Minnesota Wild, kind of disappointing in that regard, but I think Bill Guerin thinks this is a team that is kind of already, he's got what he's got, and that's it, right? And you're kind of hoping for the development of some of your players. So that's something to remember here as well as, necessarily you didn't add anybody, but some of the players that you already have here are going to just get better from just, developing through the summer and getting bigger and stronger. And, specifically guys like Brock Faber, Kalen Addison, Marco Rossi, Matt Boldy, those guys are going to continue to develop even when there isn't games on the ice. Now, keeping an eye on some of those younger guys, that could make the roster for the Wild. I think at the very least one of them will be playing with the Iowa Wild, and one of them could make this team at some point this year, depending on injuries and things like that. So keep an eye out for guys like 2021 or 2022 first-round pick, Liam Öhgren. Öhgren is definitely a guy to keep on the radar this year. I don't know if he's going to be playing in Sweden. It hasn't been confirmed yet, but he is 20 years old, so to expect him to make the Wild, it would have to be something where there's probably some kind of injury, and maybe Billy G wants to see him play a couple games with the big club, but keep an eye out for Liam Öhgren. The one I'm a little bit more confident in seeing at some point this year, maybe taking that rookie lap during his first NHL game, is Carson Lambos. Carson Lambos has played the last couple years in the Western Hockey League with the Winnipeg Ice, his hometown team there in Winnipeg where he grew up. His numbers kind of stalled out last season with the Winnipeg Ice. He kept his similar numbers to his draft season, but he is a guy from the 2021 draft that now is, we're definitely talking about professional hockey at this point at 21 years old. He is a defenseman, though, so I could see Billy G taking his time with the young defenseman. But Lambos, the potential is definitely there. He's had 30-plus points the last 2 years in the Western Hockey League each season. So keep an eye out for Carson Lambos, another former first-round pick. That's a guy you definitely expect to see at some point in the blue line for the Wild this year. Maybe not opening night, but throughout the season, keep an eye out for Lambos. My breakout candidate for the Minnesota Wild, this one's easy, and that is Brock Faber. We only saw him for 6 games during the playoffs last year and 2 games during the regular season last year. No points registered for Faber, but you look at his actual time on the ice, and he definitely passed the eye test. There's a guy that he seems like he has good gap control. He's just a good, solid defenseman. His footwork, his skating, obviously being a Minnesota native, right, definitely helps his case. But Brock Faber is a guy that a lot of Wild fans are really excited for, and for good reason. He's not going to jump off the scoreboard like an Erik Karlsson in terms of scoring a ton of points and goals for you, but he's going to be a reliable defenseman, which the Minnesota Wild honestly need desperately. So it's not necessarily something that, it's not the the big sexy name that everybody's going to be talking about, but that's the guy that's going to be important and is the fundamental piece to a defense that is critical. And that's what you're looking at with Brock Faber. With that said, it kind of leads me to my predictions because it's kind of tough with the Wild because it's easy to sit here and say that, well, they made the playoffs last year, so they should easily make the playoffs this year. And that's not the case. The reality is, especially the landscape in the Western Conference, I kind of talked about this with the Los Angeles Kings where you kind of fall into that territory where you're not the dominant team in your division. We're talking about you maybe winning the division. So now there is that level of concern, especially with changes throughout the lineup that, maybe you end up being a team that maybe is talked about being on the from the team that was on the inside, trying to stay there to maybe being on the outside looking in. And I do have that concern here for the Wild because you look at even in their own division, I think the easy one to look at is the St. Louis Blues, who missed the playoffs last year, who got better this year and are going to have some of their younger guys that are healthy, coming into the lineup, guys that were injured last year being healthy, all those factors, I think are going to make the St. Louis Blues potentially even a candidate to win that Central Division. Not only just make the playoffs, but win the division. I think that's going to be tough. And for a team like Minnesota, now that knocks you down one peg from where you were last year. We talk about Nashville. Nashville had a bad season last year. They had Ryan O'Reilly, Luke Schenn, Barry Trotz as the GM there, came in there making noise. So now you're talking about Nashville being better than they were last year, and they were a fringe playoff team last year. Now you're talking about some of those young rookies that came up last year, continuing their development through the summer. They're going to be hungry and motivated this season, plus those veteran additions by Barry Trotz in free agency. Nashville looks a lot better. So now you're talking about two teams right there in your division that automatically are going to be better, that were behind you. Now you talk about the teams that were ahead of you in the standings last year. Colorado, Dallas. I don't think those teams are going to regress all that much from where they were last year. Yeah, Landeskog, the captain, isn't there for Colorado, but he wasn't there last season. And now you talk about maybe a wild card like Jonathan Drouin coming in there. He could be a huge difference maker for them in a good way, playing alongside his former Halifax Mooseheads captain Nathan MacKinnon. The emergence of Bowen Byram this season as well. There's a lot of concern there in terms of what could happen. Dallas, who knocked them out of the playoffs, I think they're going to be right there again in terms of making the playoffs. It's hard to bet against, Dallas in any given season, and that's the case here as well. So, the only wild card here is the goaltending, and that's kind of where Minnesota does have an advantage, actually, in my opinion, which it's kind of weird to be saying that, but it's kind of a weak division for goaltending, right? You look at Colorado, as good as they were last year, you've got Pavel Francouz as your goaltending. That's a little bit concerning, to be completely fair, right? St. Louis, Jordan Binnington had a collapse of a season last year. Is he able to come back from that? Or are you going to rely on Joel Hofer, who was a young rookie? That's a little concerning, right? So now Minnesota's Gustafsson and Fleury tandem looks pretty good. Nashville, yes, you've got Askarov, you've got UC Saros. That's probably the best goaltending in the division at this point. Other than Dallas, who has Jake Ottinger, who I think is the best goaltender in this division. I think Minnesota might have the third best goalie tandem in the division. So if that's the case, that could be the edge that allows them to make the playoffs. But with that said, you have a lot of young guys that could be coming in this season, and guys that underperformed last season. You need to see a little bit more from guys like Matt Zuccarello and Joel Eriksson, who in their right mind, they weren't healthy all of last season, and that definitely hurt. Losing Joel Eriksson last season was huge, and we talk about a guy that, as good as he is, you compare his numbers to the last couple years, he's getting better, but there's just not enough around him. So despite having an impressive season last year with 61 points, you still have that sense of you want more because there's just not enough around him. But that storyline could change this year with Matt Boldy, who his contract kicks in. We expect to see more from him as he's going to be playing another full season with the Wild. There's definitely an excitement around him. He had 63 points last season. But you need to see more from some of the younger guys like Marco Rossi. He's a guy that's been taking forever to develop, and none of that to his own fault, but it's still there, right? So you want to see him continue to develop. Jared Spurgeon had a very disappointing season last year for the Minnesota Wild. You hope he gets better. Jonas Brodin, another guy we want to see a little more from. Kalen Addison. there's a lot of guys on the blue line that leave you wanting more, and that has to change. Brock Faber and Marco Rossi really have to step up this season if the Wild want to make the playoffs. So with that said, my prediction here is anywhere between 35 to 40 wins for the Wild and 85 to 90 points. I think they're a good team. They're definitely capable of making the playoffs, but there is definitely that sense of concern, especially when you look at the teams around them in that division, that, you know, there is the reality that this team could miss the playoffs with a couple of key injuries here or there. That could be the difference whether they make the playoffs or not. Now, I like Philip Gustafson. I like Marc-Andre Fleury, but the criticism could be, well, could that have just been a one-off for Gustafson where he had just a great season? Can he follow that up? You know, those are the kind of questions that we're going to be asking ourselves. But we're going to see. Can the Minnesota Wild get back into the playoffs? I want to know your guys' thoughts down below. Guys, as always, thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you again next time.